For more than 3 decades, Lindsey Graham was one of the most recognizable political figures in Washington. He was outspoken, frequently controversial, and almost impossible to ignore. Whether he was arguing about national security, defending a military intervention, criticizing a president, questioning a Supreme Court nominee, or standing beside Donald Trump, Graham seemed to be everywhere. But there was another side of his life that received far less attention. Away from Senate hearings and television cameras, Graham maintained a surprisingly private personal existence. He never married. He never had children. And despite decades of public speculation about his private relationships, there was never credible public evidence establishing that he lived with a romantic partner. In fact, the most important detail surrounding this story has changed dramatically. Lindsey Graham is no longer living anywhere. On July 11, 2026, the longtime South Carolina senator died suddenly at the age of 71. His death brought an unexpected end to one of the longest political careers in modern South Carolina history. Reuters reported that Graham died from an aortic dissection associated with arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The White House subsequently issued a proclamation honoring his life and ordering flags flown at half-staff. That means a title asking where Lindsey Graham lives with his partner needs an important correction. The more accurate question is this: where did Lindsey Graham actually live? What did his home life look like? And who was truly part of his private world? The answer is more complicated, and in some ways more interesting, than the rumors. Graham's story began in central South Carolina, a small community that would remain deeply connected to his identity. He was born on July 9, 1955, into a working-class family. His parents operated a restaurant and pool hall, and Graham grew up in an environment far removed from the polished world of Washington politics that would eventually become his professional home. According to his official Senate biography, Graham was the first member of his family to attend college. He studied at the University of South Carolina, earning both his undergraduate and law degrees. That education eventually led him into the military, where he served as an Air Force lawyer. But before Washington, before the Senate, before presidential campaigns and national television appearances, Graham experienced a tragedy that shaped virtually every part of his adult life. He lost both of his parents while he was still a young man. His mother died first. His father died not long afterward. Graham was only 22 years old. His younger sister, Darlene, was just 13. Suddenly, Graham was forced into a role that few people his age could have imagined. He became responsible for helping raise his younger sister. That experience mattered because it helps explain something about Graham's private life that is often overlooked. For all the attention paid to his politics, he spent much of his adult life without the traditional family structure that many politicians have. There was no spouse accompanying him to political events. There were no children appearing beside him at campaign rallies. There was no presidential family-style household surrounding his career. Instead, one of the most important personal relationships in his life was the bond he shared with his younger sister. That relationship continued for decades. And in 2026, following Graham's death, his sister Darlene became an especially prominent figure in South Carolina politics. She was appointed to temporarily fill the Senate seat left vacant by her brother's death and later entered the special election campaign to seek the seat permanently. It was an extraordinary turn in the Graham family story. But long before that happened, Lindsey Graham had already developed a very different kind of life. After law school, he joined the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps. The military became more than a job. It became a major part of his identity. Graham served in Europe and later in the Air Force Reserve. He was eventually promoted to colonel and continued performing military duties even after entering Congress. According to his official biography, Graham retired from the Air Force Reserve in June 2015 after 33 years of military service. That career had an important effect on his lifestyle. Graham became accustomed to moving between very different worlds. There was military life. There was legal work. There was South Carolina. And eventually, there was Washington. When Graham entered the House of Representatives in 1994, he began spending more and more time in the nation's capital. 8 years later, he won election to the United States Senate. From that point forward, Washington became an essential part of his professional life. But South Carolina remained home. That distinction is important. Graham's official Senate biography states that he lived in Seneca, South Carolina. Seneca is located in the northwestern part of the state, near the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains and close to Lake Kiowa. It is a very different environment from Washington, D.C. Washington is dense, political, crowded, and constantly moving. Seneca is smaller, quieter, and much closer to the landscape in which Graham grew up. For a politician who spent years surrounded by cameras, staffers, security personnel, lobbyists, reporters, and political strategists, returning to South Carolina offered something that Washington could never completely provide: a connection to home. The official biography published by Graham's Senate office specifically described him as a native South Carolinian and stated that he lived in Seneca. That is the strongest, reliable public information about his primary home. And it is worth emphasizing what it does not say. It does not say that Graham lived with a secret partner. It does not identify a romantic companion living with him. It does not establish that he maintained a hidden household with another person. That distinction matters because the internet has produced countless claims about Graham's personal life. Some of those claims were based on political attacks. Others were based on speculation. And some were simply repeated so many times that people began treating them as established facts. But repetition is not evidence. For a documentary about a real person, particularly someone who has died, the responsible approach is to separate what is documented from what was merely alleged. And when that standard is applied to Graham's romantic life, the picture becomes surprisingly simple. He never married. He never had children. And public biographical accounts have described several relationships from earlier periods of his life. According to accounts based on Graham's memoir, he dated a woman named Debbie while attending law school. During his years serving in the Air Force in Germany, he reportedly had relationships with a fellow JAG officer named Carol and later with a flight attendant named Sylvia. The relationship with Sylvia was reportedly serious enough that Graham considered proposing, but it did not lead to marriage. That relationship eventually ended, in part because of circumstances involving family and geography. Graham returned to the United States, while Sylvia's family responsibilities made relocation difficult. The relationship faded, and Graham continued on a path that eventually led him into national politics. Over time, his public identity became increasingly associated with his career rather than a conventional family life. That was unusual in American politics. Politicians often use their spouses and children as part of their public image. They appear together at rallies. They talk about family values. They pose for photographs during campaigns. Their family lives become part of their political narrative. Graham had almost none of that. His personal story was different. His closest family relationship was with his sister. His professional identity was shaped by military service and public office. And his romantic life remained largely outside the political spotlight. That privacy became one reason speculation persisted. When people cannot see something, they often try to fill the empty space with their own explanations. Graham's critics and supporters both contributed to this phenomenon. Over the years, rumors circulated about his sexuality and his supposed private relationships. But rumors are not proof. The responsible way to describe such allegations is to acknowledge that they existed while refusing to present them as established fact. That is particularly important because Graham himself did not publicly identify as gay, and there is no reliable evidence establishing that he lived with a male romantic partner. What we do know is that he remained unmarried throughout his life, and that fact alone generated plenty of questions. Why did one of America's most powerful politicians never marry? Was he simply too focused on his career? Did his childhood experiences affect his approach to relationships? Did military service and years of political work leave little room for a conventional domestic life? Or was it simply a matter of personal choice? There may never be a complete answer, and perhaps there does not need to be one. Graham himself once offered a humorous explanation for never marrying, essentially suggesting that he either never found enough time to meet the right woman or that the right woman was smart enough not to put up with his schedule. It was classic Graham humor, self-deprecating, direct, and revealing in its own way. His schedule really was extraordinary. During his Senate years, Graham became one of the most active voices on foreign policy and national security. He traveled frequently. He appeared on television. He participated in hearings. He met foreign leaders. He traveled to conflict zones. He worked on legislation. He campaigned. And he continued maintaining relationships throughout the Republican Party. This was not the lifestyle of someone with a predictable 9-to-5 job. His career demanded constant movement. Washington was his workplace. South Carolina was his political base. And the military remained an important part of his identity long after his active duty years ended. So what did his home life actually look like? The honest answer is that very little of the interior details were publicly documented. And that may have been intentional. Graham was a public figure who spent enormous amounts of time discussing national security. He understood the risks that came with visibility. Politicians, particularly senior lawmakers involved in foreign policy, face security concerns that ordinary citizens do not. That is one reason responsible reporting should avoid publishing exact residential addresses, security arrangements, entry points, or other information that could put someone at risk. What can be said is that Graham had a home base in Seneca. His Senate biography identified Seneca as his place of residence. He also maintained a significant presence in Washington because of his Senate responsibilities. The capital was where he spent much of his working life. That meant his existence was effectively divided between two worlds. South Carolina represented home. Washington represented power. And the contrast between the two locations tells us something about Graham himself. He never completely abandoned the identity of the small-town South Carolinian. Even after decades in Washington, his accent and conversational style retained traces of his upbringing. He often spoke in an informal, sometimes blunt manner. He could be serious one moment and joking the next, and he frequently emphasized his South Carolina roots. That connection was politically useful, but it also appeared to be deeply personal. Graham was not someone who seemed eager to reinvent himself as a Washington insider in every aspect of his life. Instead, he built a career in Washington while continuing to identify strongly with South Carolina. That may help explain why Seneca remained important to him. It was close to the environment that shaped him. It was far from the constant political noise of Capitol Hill, and it provided the kind of privacy that Washington could not. But then came July 2026. Everything changed. On July 11th, Graham was in Washington. He had recently returned from a trip to Ukraine. That same night, he suffered a sudden medical emergency. Emergency personnel responded to his Washington residence, according to reporting from NPR and other outlets. He was transported to George Washington University Hospital. He died later that night. He was 71. The news stunned Washington. For decades, Graham had been a constant presence. Regardless of whether people agreed with him, he was familiar. He had become part of the landscape of American politics. Then suddenly he was gone. His office announced that his family appreciated prayers and asked for privacy. Preliminary findings from the District of Columbia medical examiner later indicated that the cause of death was an aortic dissection associated with arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The circumstances made his Washington residence part of the final chapter of his life. But that does not mean Washington was the only place that mattered to him. South Carolina remained central to his identity. His political career had been built there. His family history was there. His sister was there. And his official biography continued to identify Seneca as his home. In the weeks following his death, South Carolina began dealing with an unusual political situation. The state needed a new senator, and the person chosen to temporarily occupy Graham's seat was someone who knew him better than almost anyone else. His sister, Darlene Graham. Her appointment transformed the Graham family story into something that almost sounds fictional. A young woman who had lost her parents as a teenager. An older brother who had helped raise her. That brother became a congressman, then a senator, then one of the most recognizable Republicans in America. And after his death, the younger sister entered the Senate herself. It was an extraordinary ending to the family chapter that began with tragedy decades earlier. But it also raises an important point about the title of this story. If the goal is to discover the partner Lindsey Graham lived with, the evidence simply does not support that claim. There is no credible public record establishing that he lived with a romantic partner at the time of his death. There are documented relationships from earlier stages of his life. There are years of speculation. There are internet rumors. There are political attacks. But those things are not the same as evidence. The most defensible conclusion is much more straightforward. Lindsey Graham lived a largely private personal life while maintaining an intensely public professional life. He lived in Seneca, South Carolina, according to his official biography. He also maintained a Washington presence because of his Senate career. He never married. He had no children. And he did not publicly establish a long-term romantic partnership that became part of his public biography. That may sound less sensational than the rumors, but the truth does not need to be sensational to be interesting. In fact, Graham's real personal story is extraordinary enough without inventing anything. Think about what happened to him. He grew up in a working-class South Carolina family. He experienced the deaths of both parents while still in his 20s. He helped raise his younger sister. He became a lawyer. He joined the Air Force. He served for more than 3 decades in uniform. He entered the House of Representatives. He became a United States Senator. He ran for president. He went from being one of Donald Trump's harshest Republican critics to one of Trump's most visible allies. He became an influential voice on foreign policy. He traveled repeatedly to war zones. He remained in public life for more than 30 years. And then, in July 2026, his life ended suddenly. That is the real story. Not a secret mansion. Not a confirmed hidden partner. Not an undisclosed romantic household. But a man whose public career was enormous while his private life remained comparatively small and carefully guarded. There is another interesting element to Graham's story. His home was never simply about property. For him, the idea of home was closely connected to identity. He was raised in Central. He represented South Carolina. He maintained a residence in Seneca. And even while working in Washington, he continued presenting himself as a South Carolinian first. That connection mattered politically because South Carolina voters repeatedly returned him to office. But it also mattered personally. Politicians sometimes become so absorbed in national politics that they gradually lose their connection to the communities that originally elected them. Graham never entirely did that. He kept returning to South Carolina. He maintained offices throughout the state. His Senate operation had regional offices serving different parts of South Carolina, including the upstate, Midlands, PD, Low Country, Piedmont, and Golden Corner regions. That network reflected the way Graham approached politics. Washington might have been where the biggest decisions happened, but South Carolina was where his political identity lived, and Seneca was the place officially associated with his home. There is also a lesson here about celebrity-style political storytelling. A title can create an expectation. This is where Lindsey Graham lies with his partner. It immediately suggests that there is a secret person, a hidden residence, and perhaps a dramatic revelation waiting behind the door. But when the evidence is examined, that narrative falls apart. There was no verified partner to reveal. There was no credible evidence that he maintained a secret shared residence. And because Graham died in July 2026, the title itself is now written in the present tense about someone who is no longer alive. A responsible documentary has to acknowledge that. Otherwise, the audience may be given